And we're live. David de Jong, how are you?
Mark, I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing
Thank
excellent.
you for having me.
Of course, of course. Thank you so much for being here in our beautiful tent deep in the woods.
Deep in the woods of Williamsburg.
Yeah. But no, we're not in New York. We're far away.
Big Sur, right?
Yeah, we're in Big Sur. Exactly right. No, we're live right now. Thank you to everyone that's tuned in, that's commenting. A lot of people have actually been saying, "Is this really live?" Everyone's like, "Oh, are you guys really live?" Right now, it is 12:27. Actually, let's round up. It's 12:30. We're in the future. That's how live we are. We've never been more live. Thank you so much. You just traveled all the way from Amsterdam.
I did.
Yesterday.
The night before.
A little jet lagged.
Actually, I am. Yeah. I conked out last night at like 8:30.
Yeah. Well, right now in Amsterdam, it's probably like 6 o'clock. You should be ready to go. You're ready. I am. You're ready to party.
I'm ready to go.
Amazing.
I'm ready to go.
Really excited to chat. You have a very interesting life and story. Some of which we're not going to be able to get into. Currently, you're working as a Middle Eastern correspondent, obviously covering the war in the Middle East, which is fascinating. Not the discussion today. You wrote a book a couple years ago called Nazi Billionaires.
That is correct.
Which is very interesting. Basically looking at and examining the elite dynasties that still persist in Germany today that got very wealthy off of World War II. In a bunch of different ways. And I guess I want to unpack those stories, who those families are, the heirs today, where they are, and go through the details of that. But then additionally, the conversation has brought in a larger moral argument that I think is very fascinating. What is the responsibility of these families? What do they do now? And what are the precedents for that throughout history? And what are the common or the modern ties to our current political landscape? I just think there's a ton to unpack. People that are listening along, if you want to comment, whenever we go to a break, we'll look at some comments from the audience. So please feel free to jump in. And also, you being Dutch, we were just talking about. Obviously, you guys are very vivacious.
You were making a lot of fun of the Dutch.
I was not. David, don't do that. I was not. I said that the Dutch were vivacious, and you guys were very gregarious, and you're.
You said they didn't laugh at your show.
No.
They said it was great afterwards, but they didn't laugh. And you were like, why are they not laughing?
We did do a show in Amsterdam, okay? Yeah. And for all the Dutch people watching, just lighten up a little, okay? We do the show, and the show, it was awesome. The venue was beautiful, and everyone was very sweet. But there's just a stoicism.
I'm deeply insulted. You've mistaken us for Scandinavians.
It's annoying too because we were in Dublin like 2 nights before.
Oh yeah,
and right. That show.
But the Irish are more stoic though. They're like really unfazed.
I think
way more than the Dutch for sure. 100%.
Unfazed, perhaps. Stoic, I don't think you can. I don't know if you can say the Irish are stoic.
All right, fair enough. Okay.
Yeah, but I guess when they're sober, maybe, but they're never sober. Right. So
they're resistant to psychoanalysis. The Irish.
What do you mean?
They can't. They don't do therapy. It's like they're like resistant to therapy.
That is true. All my Irish American friends, that is carried over. Yeah. They're like, what do I need to talk to some guy about it? I'll just go to the bar, talk to my buddy, and that's free. I'm like, honestly, good point.
Particularly the last few decades worked out well for Ireland.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, right? They've been doing pretty good.
Yeah, absolutely.
They've been having a good time.
Absolutely.
So this book, Nazi Billionaires, very interesting. What inspired you to examine these families? Why did you want to write this book?
So I was a reporter here in New York at Bloomberg News, and I was hired on a new investigative team back in 2011, late 2011. Actually, it's this week today that I started 13 years ago, week of Thanksgiving. And I started on this investigative team which focused on family-owned companies and family offices and hidden wealth in North America. But I was soon asked by my American bosses, because I'm Dutch, they asked, can't you also cover the German-speaking companies? and family businesses and families, like the ruling families of Germany, basically. And I didn't have the heart to tell them that my German at that point wasn't very good. They were like, they've just thought Dutch, German, it's all the same. We'll give this Dutch guy,
Is it different? I guess it is different.
It is very different. I would say the German language is more broad, and the Dutch is kind of this basic. I don't want to insult my fellow compatriots, but it's this mix between English and German, basically. It's a bastardized language.
Yeah.
And so I said yes. And so what I ended up doing was I would spend a month a year between Thanksgiving and Christmas going to the Bloomberg bureaus in Germany, Austria, Switzerland. And the stories that I came back with were always this mix of the financial and the historical and the business side of things. And what really struck me in my reporting was that companies like BMW and Porsche and Audi and you name it, mainly the car brands, which are really the backbone of the German economy, even still today. But particularly the families that control them today, would celebrate their fathers and grandfathers for their business successes, but would leave out any mention of their war crimes and their Nazi affiliations after they had prepared to have reckoned with these crimes, and particularly on like major global foundations, major museums, academic chairs, corporate headquarters named after these men, and I found that to be such a brazen whitewashing of history, such a distortion of history, that I wanted to shine a light on that. So it initially in a series of articles for Bloomberg News, and then I ended up leaving New York in 2017 and actually moving to Berlin to research and write a book on the topic, and that ended up being Nazi Billionaires. And I'd spent 4 years being completely delved into archives and other things to focus on the topic.
Interesting. There's a great quote that I saw that I thought was quite funny. Never ask a woman her age.
Right.
Never ask someone their weight, and then never ask a German company what they were doing between 1939 and 1945.
It's one of my favorite memes.
Yeah. And we're violating the last one today.
We're going to be violating it brutally.
Yeah. So I'm curious. We're
going to pay them back in kind, basically.
Yeah. So I'm curious. Could you just take me through the first of maybe a couple families that we'll be examining, and I guess just take me through the whole story. I guess like from Weimar Republic to eventually sort of working with the Third Reich and the National Socialists, and then what ultimately comes of them.
Totally, yeah. So the book, just to set the scene, the book starts in February 20th, 1933, with Hitler having seized power 3 weeks earlier in Germany, and his right-hand man, Hermann Göring, who's then the president of the German Parliament, not yet defunct, sends a telegram to 24 of Germany's, most influential and wealthiest industrialists and financiers, CEOs, and business heirs. And what he says that Hitler is going to do there is to explain his economic policy. But what it actually turns out to be, he gives a speech, rambles on for 90 minutes. Then Göring gives a speech, rambles on for 90 minutes. And what is very clear is that they want to raise money from the industrialists and the financiers and the CEOs and the business heirs because they want to stage one last election campaign. And what the industrialists don't know, what the businessmen don't know, is that the Nazi Party is in dire straits. The finances are, they're 12 million Reichsmark in debt, and their hold on power is pretty tenuous. And I think, what is very clear is it's explicitly promised to them by both Hitler and Göring in their speeches this is going to be the last election that's going to happen in Germany for the next 10 to 100 years. So it's very clear to them, to the men assembled who have never met Hitler before or Göring in many instances, that if they get their checkbooks out, they're going to sign over German democracy. Basically, and they have no qualms doing that. They have no qualms, selling out the end of German democracy. Wow. They get their checkbooks out, and the whole campaign financing becomes irrelevant in the end because a week later the Reichstag is set on fire, and martial law is declared by Hitler, and all the socialists and communists are rounded up. And the election of March 5th, 1933 doesn't even become relevant anymore because even the Nazi Party doesn't get a majority. But by mid-March, Hitler has suspended parliament, and it's the end. He becomes the Führer.
It's a coup, effectively.
It's a coup. Yeah. It's a coup. It's a coup, and it's the end of German democracy for the next 12 to 17 years, depending on how you look at it.
How did the industrialists by 1933 in Germany accrue, I guess, so much wealth post World War I? It seems like,
Yeah.
the Treaty of Versailles really, hamstrung the German economy, but yet you have these, automotive industry and culinary industry and other industries within Germany that are still seemingly doing very well. What was happening with that?
So it was really hyperinflation, which caused, some of the industrialists that I write about in the book to speculate. I mean, they become speculators and they make huge profits by buying up companies on the cheap, which are, this is the early 1920s. You're totally right. I mean, the Treaty of Versailles has hamstrung the entire German economy, has pushed it to the edge. And hyperinflation really allows these men who have become very wealthy of producing, whether it's steel or uniforms or you name it, during World War I, to punt these profits into buying up companies on the cheap. Now, of course, fast forward to 1933, and you're at the tail end of the Great Depression, and these men, are they're only interested in protecting their bottom line and protecting their fortunes and their companies, and they're by and large opportunists, right, who thrive in any political system, whether that's the German Empire, the Weimar Republic, the Third Reich, occupied West Germany, reunified Germany. They adapt to whatever political system is in power. I would argue they would have even adapted in a communist. They would even come out on top in a communist system. Mm-hmm. And they really, what Hitler initially promises them, also in this speech, is that he's going to initiate the largest rearmament program that the world has ever seen. And he delivers on that promise, right? I mean, before you know it, by late 1933, early 1934, there's billions of Reichsmarks are flowing into the coffers of the industrialists and their steel and armaments companies. So the German economy is churning again. And that in itself, of course, is not criminal, but it quickly devolves into criminal behavior with, the expropriation of Jewish-owned businesses, and then, of course, the expropriation in German-occupied territories during World War II, and with the, really the low point being the mass exploitation of people forced into forced or slave labor. Estimated 12 to 20 million Europeans were exploited in German companies and mines during World War II.
Right. So you would say World War I was a wealth transfer moment as well.
Yeah, I mean,
massively.
Totally. Because the five families that I write about, one of the myths I wanted to dispel with the book was that these families all have became rich during the Third Reich, under the Nazi regime, or off of World War II. No, most of these families were already incredibly wealthy prior to Hitler seizing power, with the exception in the book of the Porche family, which today controls not only Porsche and Volkswagen, but also Audi, Seat, Lamborghini, Skoda, and many other car brands. They really laid the foundation for their wealth because as a result of the Nazi regime and under, and supported by Hitler due to the production of the Volkswagen, which Ferdinand Porsche was commissioned by Hitler to develop it.
Yeah, the Volkswagen, the people's car.
The people's car, exactly. But the people didn't actually ended up receiving it during the Third Reich. It was only the British military after the war put the Volkswagen into production, and it was only delivered to the elite, to the Nazi elite. It was only 500 Volkswagens made prior to the war breaking out in 1933, and they all went to the Nazi elite. So it was never the people's car, as conceived by the Nazis. It was only became the people's car after the war.
Oh, interesting. So I guess that kind of sets the stage, right? You have these large industrialist families. Yeah. Hitler comes into power, and I'm curious, how much autonomy did they have, right? Like if we look, maybe like a modern parallel. And again, I don't know this to be necessarily a fact. I'm not an expert in Chinese foreign affairs, but there's the Chinese government and then Chinese industry, and it seems like they're not particularly decoupled. There seems to be like a lot of alignment. Yeah. So sometimes I look at Chinese companies that are working within the CCP, and it's like, do they have a choice to sort of engage with this, or is it basically like, hey, join us or die? What is the sort of political bargain? I understand early on there's an economic incentive, like, hey, just give us the money and we will, pump, cash back into the economy. Does that change once there's military aggression into Poland, et cetera? And how much autonomy do these companies actually have?
I mean, there's definitely Devil's Pact, which is made on, in the winter of 1933, starting with that speech by the implicit or explicit support by these industrialists of Hitler's regime, this kind of, quid pro quo, where they would implicitly or explicitly support the regime. And as long as they kept their mouth shut, they would have the orders flowing to them and they could rob, competitors or oust competitors or take over competitors at a fire sale price. And again, it's a sliding scale of morality. It starts with the weapons production and the veneer of legality that many of the business transactions had in the second half of the 1930s, but it quickly devolves into outright criminal behavior that companies get seized without, and families not being compensated at all, for example. And of course, with the low point of being the mass exploitation of people in slave and forced labor, the millions of them. But I always, the two examples that I would say show the agency that the industrialists had during the Third Reich was first and foremost, many of you, would know ThyssenKrupp, right? The big steel company, or Thyssen or Krupp, like the big the steel behemoth. And Fritz Thyssen was this, establishment industrialist, heir to the Thyssen steel empire. And he was an ardent Nazi sympathizer, one of the first, because the industrialists didn't support the Nazis. They were conservative. They were establishment conservatives. They didn't support the Nazis. They thought the Nazis were, kind of these gauche clowns from the impoverished hinterlands, and they wanted nothing to do with Hitler. Only when he came into power and he promised them wealth, that they started supporting them, or promised them more wealth and the protection of their businesses, that they started supporting them. But Fritz Thyssen was an outlier and was already from 1925 supported Hitler, financed him. But and even became a symbolic member of parliament in the defunct parliament. But for some reason, which has never become entirely clear to anyone, he decides to vote against, in this symbolic parliament, vote against Hitler's invasion of Poland of September 1933. And as a result, he has to flee. He initially flees to Paris and has an American journalist pen his kind of whitewashing memoir, which is still available, which is titled "I Paid Hitler." And subsequently, once the Nazis invade France, is arrested and is then, sent to multiple concentration camps, and his entire steel empire is expropriated and is given to the right-hand man of one of my main characters in the book, Friedrich Flick. And as a result, so he's not only sent to concentration camps by the Germans, but after the war, ironically, whereas all the other industrialists don't, or most of the other industrialists don't get indicted, the Allies also indict him because he was such an early supporter of Hitler. So he gets it from both sides twice. And he ends up dying in a car crash in 1950. But my point being is that Thyssen, who was this ardent supporter, chooses, for whatever reasons, to turn against the regime and flees. And he knew that he would lose his steel empire as a result, but he still, they still had a choice, right?
Right.
The choice being that they would lose their companies and their livelihoods. But, they had a choice. So there was agency to turn against the regime. The consequences were dire. But for anybody that used the excuse always, but they had no choice, they did have a choice. Mm-hmm. It would cost them, but they had a choice.
You become an economic martyr, effectively.
Exactly. You do. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's a perfect dilemma. right?
Yes.
Like I've accrued millions, potentially billions of dollars in this country, and a regime takes over, and they ask me to be a part of it. And if I join, I'll get richer, and if I leave, I lose absolutely everything, and potentially even my life. He was in a concentration camp, and ostensibly he could have been, killed or died of disease or whatever. So yeah, that's again, you look at once you get into the nuance, you're like, yeah, that sucks, but good for him, I mean, right? Doing the right thing.
I mean, doing the right thing, but it's of course very dual, right? Because he's actually one of the earliest supporters of Hitler,
right.
And then 14 years later, for whatever reasons, his conscience, starts to play up already in September 1939, and he then decides to kind of make a stand to vote against the German invasion of Poland and the start of World War II. So in a way, the history is on his side in terms of being early in making a stand, right? Because another example is the well-known industrialist called Robert Bosch of Bosch, all the electrical engineering, which is still one of the largest electrical engineering companies today, and he's actually an avowed pacifist and a social democrat and one of the richest men in Germany, but an ardent. Absolutely detests Hitler. But even he is unable to get away, and even through his right-hand man finances the fledgling German resistance, to the extent there was a resistance, but, tries to get money to the resistance in Germany. But even he didn't escape from using, he dies in 1942, but doesn't, his companies don't escape from using forced and slave labor during the war and being a mass armaments producer. So even those that were explicitly opposed to Hitler end up, profiting in some way from the regime.
Wow. Were there any business interests that were leading the political interests, or was it primarily political interests that were then pulling in the business interests?
Definitely the latter. It was for sure the political interests that paved the way for made it accessible, or made it, well, not necessarily appropriate is probably not the right word, but enabled these men to say, well, we're going to work with the regime that is in power. Mind you, there was enormous political and economic volatility in the Weimar Republic, right? I mean, it's not only hyperinflation of the early 1920s, but then the Great Depression hits in the late 1920s. And you have, millions of Germans, just like in the U.S., out on the streets. It's really the situation economically and politically is so dire. You have three subsequent different governments. There's elections every other 6 months. And what these men want for their businesses to thrive is economic stability. And again, this is what Hitler initially delivers on. Yeah.
But there was no, I know we're going to discuss some of the families that were actually high up, within the National Socialists that were, very sympathetic to the cause.
Yeah.
But were there any that were sort of encouraging, high brass Nazis to invade Poland, go actually take on like an offensive war to justify or sort of line their pockets financially? No,
because one thing I've learned from the research of this book is that, contrary to popular opinion, war is actually not profitable. War is only profitable if you're on the winning side, which they initially were, right? But once the tide turns in Stalingrad after February 1943, it becomes a very unprofitable endeavor. And the industrialists know this because, yes, World War I has been good to them, but in the end, Germany was on the losing side. And now, and then, in the by 1943, it also turns, and of course the industrialists are aware of the experiences that they've had in World War I, which, yes, was profitable, but in the long run, of course, was not profitable at all, given the state of Germany and following the war. So they didn't. They certainly didn't encourage anybody to go to war. It was really the Nazi regime which was, clamoring, or Hitler for really, because they were worried because, again, in the long run, war is not good. for business. It's good the first few years, but then, particularly as it turns, you know, it's terrible.
And probably particularly domestic war. I can imagine
Absolutely.
that probably changes the equation a little bit.
Right.
So I can see these industrialists saying, look, we were able to grow our empires after World War I. We ate up all these smaller companies. We absolutely grew our market share and potentially monopolized the entire nation. But in the long run, there's so much volatility. It's like, okay, we own the whole pie, but the pie could be worth nothing, you know, 1 month and be worth something the next month. And that is stressful from a business perspective.
Yeah, exactly. Because you have loans, you have, you know, I mean, let's you think about the banks, right? Like Deutsche Bank, Commerzbank, all these banks which financed or Allianz, which, you know, these companies financed and insured things like concentration camps, extermination camps, all of that, right? I mean, they're so deep in with the regime, and they have all these loans out as well for these massive industrial projects, right? As the war turns, I mean, credit also dries up. Banks are not willing to extend loans anymore to the regime and to other companies. And it becomes, you know, the war becomes adverse to business. I mean, it's just not a good value proposition anymore. I mean, it's literally dead. And it starts off in 1933 to being a good value proposition. Yeah,
I see. So you mentioned Porche. Who is that family, and who was the sort of main person that was friendly with the National Socialists, and how did that entire story sort of unfold?
Yeah. So there's three co-founders of the Porche car design firm in 1930. The first is Ferdinand Porsche, who is the engineering brain later in the development of Porsche of the Volkswagen, but also the engineering brain behind the Porsche car design firm. There's a son-in-law, this very combative lawyer called Anton Pierre. And there is a third man called Adolf Rosenberger, who was actually the Jewish co-founder of Porsche. Rosenberger gets pushed out of Porsche in 1935 after the Nuremberg race laws or just before the Nuremberg race laws go into effect, because he's a Jew. And
oh, wow. Is that after Kristallnacht?
That is before Kristallnacht. That's 3 years before Kristallnacht.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And he actually ends up fleeing to the U.S., settles in Los Angeles, but is subsequently erased from Porsche history. So you have two men, Ferdinand Porsche and his son-in-law Anton Pierre, who are running the show. Ferdinand Porsche brings in his son, Ferry Porsche, who later becomes known as the mastermind behind the first Porsche sports car. So between father and son, you know, you have the brains behind the Volkswagen, and you have the brains behind the Porsche sports car. Now, as I said earlier, the Volkswagen actually doesn't get produced for the people during the war. Hitler, who has commissioned Ferdinand Porsche to build the Volkswagen or to produce the Volkswagen, actually also commissions the largest car factory in Europe or in the world at that time, which is in the center of Germany, modeled after the River Rouge car factory in Detroit, because Henry Ford and Hitler had a mutual platon. You know, they adored each other.
Right.
Henry Ford also, you know, virulent anti-Semite, you know, and idolized Hitler, and Hitler idolized him too.
Did Ford ever fund or financially back the Third Reich?
No. So there's a memoir of one of Hitler's right-hand men who goes to the U.S. to fund or to raise financing for the then fledgling Nazi Party. We're talking late 1920s, early 1930s. And he actually goes to Henry Ford, and Henry Ford doesn't want to give money. He just gives his kind of vocal support. I mean, he also had this newspaper that he published in Dearborn, Michigan, which you know, was again a lot of anti-Semitic vitriol and, you know, propagating a lot of you know, conspiracy theories. But he was also very vocal in his support for the German Nazi Party and also for
And why did he not want to fund it? Was he concerned about, you know, blowback to his company?
Well, there were that's a good question. It's just like he didn't want to spend money on a fledgling foreign political party.
Interesting. Yeah. I guess I wonder if he got wrapped up with the sort of isolationist ideals of
Exactly.
America at that time.
Right.
Like, look, there's a
Father
distant,
Coughlin and all these things.
right?
Yeah.
Like a distant support,
Lindbergh.
but I'm not going to necessarily fund this in some capacity.
Yeah.
That's interesting. And I'm curious, is it just pure coincidence? I mean, we're talking about Ford, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Porsche. That these are all automobile companies? Is this just pure coincidence?
I mean, yeah, in a way it is. Well, it's coincidence in the sense that the car companies were, because mind you, at that time, right, in the early 1930s, you're at the start of the automotive era, in a way. And of course, Hitler's pet project, the people's car, the Volkswagen, is so important to him, right? It's so central to his idea of mass mobilization. But in a way, it was quite prescient because it becomes, in the 1950s, of course, Germany becomes the economic powerhouse built on mass motorization. And still is today. Again, the car companies, but also a lot of the manufacturers that produce car parts globally are hugely profitable enterprises, and they're all based in Germany, and they're all based, or many of them are based in Germany. And we're talking about, not the famous names, but also companies you've never heard of, which produce car parts. They're based in the most remote parts of Germany, and these are global multinational enterprises, which with tens of billions of revenue each year. So he certainly was onto something. But in terms of from an ideological perspective, it is, it is just that is a coincidence. Yeah,
strange.
Yeah.
So back to the Porsche family.
Yeah.
So they're, they are now involved with Hitler, and they're kind of, they've ousted one of their co-founders.
Yeah.
Was that an internal sort of ousting, or was that just pressure from the government to get Rosenberger out?
No, that was an internal ousting. It was really
because they were sympathetic to the cause.
So Ferdinand Porsche was just wanted to get his. Was a sheer opportunist.
Right.
He was just interested in making his designs. He was honorary named an SS officer, all of that, but he never showed up in uniform. Now his son-in-law Anton Pierre was a different story. He joined actually the Nazi Party twice, one in his homeland Austria, which was Hitler's homeland too, and again in Germany, and also later joins the SS, the paramilitary group, as an honorary officer. But so is Ferry Porsche, Ferdinand's son, who runs the Porsche. Once Ferdinand Porsche and his son-in-law are busy with the Volkswagen and running, the largest car factory in the world in the center of Germany, and retooling that at the beginning of the war from a car a car factory to an armaments factory, one of the largest armaments factories in the world, as a matter of fact. They're busy with getting tens of thousands of forced enslaved laborers in, or building a satellite concentration camp, courtesy of the SS, on the Volkswagen factory complex. And you have horrific stories of hundreds of babies dying in a nearby orphanage that are taken away from the forced enslaved laborers who give birth in the camp, and under most horrific circumstances. I mean, thousands of people died at the Volkswagen factory, and it was really one of the most horrific places to be forced to work at. And this is run by Ferdinand Porsche and his son-in-law Anton Pierre.
Wow.
Because they're building bombs, they're building parts for tanks, or the forces, the people forced into slave and forced labor are coerced into building these parts. In meantime, you have Ferry Porsche, who's running the Porsche car design firm in Stuttgart, in the south of Germany. And he is also, like his brother-in-law, an ideological Nazi. He joins the Nazi Party in 1930, in the late 1930s, and then also applies to become an SS officer. And actually, after the war, he surrounds himself with former high-ranking SS officers in the boardroom of Porsche, which then becomes a global brand. And one of the man who introduces Porsche to the U.S., what becomes one of its most important markets, is this high-ranking former SS officer called Albert Prinzing. So he surrounds himself with SS officers in the Porsche boardroom after the war, and he also, writes, a lot of anti-Semitic vitriol about Adolf Rosenberger, who manages to escape to the U.S. and is, lives his life in Los Angeles. So it's really kind of a continuation that even after the war, Ferry Porsche particularly could be named an ideologue as opposed to his father.
Wow. Why did the Nuremberg trials not affect that family?
Because the Nuremberg trials, for many reasons, become very curtailed as the Cold War emerges, right? You have, the U.S. for the Truman administration, the Nazis and Nazi Germany become ancient history, and the focus is now on containing the Soviet Union and spread of communism, and as a result, the aim becomes rebuilding West Germany as a viable democratic state and as the economic powerhouse it once was, as a buffer and a bulwark against the Soviet Union and against occupied Eastern Germany, communist Eastern Germany. So the scope of the Nuremberg trials becomes very limited. There's only 3 industrialist trials that end up happening. But the majority of suspected Nazi war criminals and ardent Nazi sympathizers are actually handed back to West German authorities for these so-called denazification trials, which end up devolving into kind of a show trials, and not of the Stalinist kind, but of the everybody goes scot-free kind, because there was, of course, no incentive on the side of the West German authorities to judge their fellow compatriots on crimes that they had committed themselves or that they had participated in or sympathies that they had held. So one of the other myths I really tried to dispel with this book is that denazification, which in the US is often seen as kind of this successful product that, all of Germany was, we conquered that country and then we denazified Germany, was an abject failure, as a matter of fact, and was never... and not only on the business, on every level of society, not only on the business side of things, but in the legal world, in the medical world, in education, there was a continuation of money and power from the Third Reich to West Germany, and those 5 years that the Allied occupation authorities, the U.S. being leading in that, between 1945 and late 1949, had a chance to properly denazify Germany, or at least give supervision to these so-called denazification trials. That was, a huge missed opportunity to properly, supervise that. But Germany was in total chaos.
Yeah, I mean, I can see the geopolitical problem here.
Yes,
and I wonder, do you think that they looked at post-World War I Treaty of Versailles and how that affected the German state? I talked to this a friend of mine, Professor Dr. Benjamin Hett. He's just a professor of specifically 20th century history. And he broke down, he kind of weighed in on World War I specifically, that Treaty of Versailles, some historians believe, either should have been more lenient or way more stark. Either, a complete sort of dissolution of the, German state, and the Austro-Hungarian state, and all of it should be compartmentalized, or just kind of forgive and move on and help them rebuild their economy. Yeah. And instead, they sort of took like a half measure, which destroyed the economy, created a ton of volatility, created a very angry populace of young people that wanted to basically get their get back, and were looking for a leader, and they were in so much disarray, which created the events of World War II. So I'm curious, do you think they saw World War I and said, okay, if we need to create a buffer with the Soviet Union and we need a now democratic German state, we can't just destroy all their industry, so unfortunately we have to kind of look the other way?
I mean, that was a major consideration, because initially what you had at the end of the war in the Roosevelt administration, you had the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, who proposed the Morgenthau Plan, which called for the complete destruction of German industry and the wholesale summarily execution of all German industrialists without a trial, right? And that plan was viable for a while, and then it was thrown out for this more cautious approach initially with which led to restitution and compensation claims and the Nuremberg trials. But all of that also quickly went out of the window once the Cold War started, right?
Oh, that's so
There was
interesting.
a small window.
Yeah, the Cold War immediately shifted focus.
Early 1947, right? So you have basically, there's Germany concedes the war on May 8th, 1945. And so you basically have 18 months of a punitive policy, right, under Truman, which then shifts from early 1947 onwards to a accommodating policy vis-a-vis Germany, and focusing on containing the Soviet Union and the spread of communism.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you think the industrialists knew this? Did they have any premonition? Did you think they hedged at all to say, like, hey, if we win the war, then everything's great, but if we lose, we are too big to fail, so to speak?
Totally. There was a lot of writing on the wall already where, industrialists who would get arrested would say to the soldiers that arrested them, I'm happy to come march with you all to Moscow and things like that, right? Or saying that, it's better to be denazified in the American occupation part of Germany because the Americans are more sympathetic to capitalism. So I will go scot-free, and it turned out to be right.
Wow, that they even had a premonition.
It was denazification arbitrage where they would be, you didn't want to be in the French zone because French zone. The French zone.
You don't want to be in the French zone.
You don't want to be in the French zone either. In the French zone, because the communists were a big part of the French government at the time, so they would come down hard on the industrialists. The Brits, which were also in economic dire straits, you didn't want to, you preferably didn't want to be denazified by the Brits either. So the Americans, the American economy was booming. They didn't want to put capitalism on trial. The Soviet Union was now their big enemy. So
I mean, the exact opposite. You don't want to put capitalism on trial. You want to promote capitalism.
You want to promote capitalism, and here are your capitalists, right? Who have participated in
war crimes.
in mass war crimes. Tens of thousands have exploited. Thousands have been killed in their factories or have died in their factories.
Wow.
But what are you? This is the conundrum that you're faced with.
Wow. Yeah. And I mean, let the record show, right? It wasn't only the German industrialists that were able to sort of get leniency and had leverage, post World War II. I think that's actually an important point that I never really fully understood, that when a war ends, it's not like, oh, this side is fully the winner and this side is fully the loser. When you're losing a war, you still have some leverage and you're still able to negotiate a little bit. And it's an interesting concept that I never fully grasped. And America, I don't think is it by any means sort of alleviated of this, because if you look at German scientists,
right.
America was like, all right, you did some bad stuff, but we need some rockets. Yeah. So come on over here, Operation Paperclip.
Yeah, totally.
Right. So
Werner von Braun, absolutely,
yeah, exactly. So
and many others.
So we can look at obviously the denazification in Germany and be like, oh, this was a sham, but it's like, these people had leverage. It's like, look, we did war crimes. We were a part of a regime that was wholly evil by, every definition. But we also have something that's invaluable to you, and you have another war. Totally. So what are you going to give me? And so we bring over all these Nazi scientists. We're like, all right, build a rocket, get us up there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a fascinating conundrum. Again, I think most people, or at least for me, I should speak for myself, didn't realize that, like, even when you're losing a war, there's still leverage.
Totally. And I mean, also in the chaos that was post-war Germany, right? I mean, it's divided into all these occupation zones. And of course, the irony is that there were all the industrialists I wrote about were wholesale expropriated in the Soviet occupied Eastern Germany. Mm-hmm. But the Allies, in the end, allowed them to keep everything, because once you were denazified, you got all your assets which were frozen, and your board positions. You got everything back, and you could just go back to work. You know? So they didn't need to go anywhere either; they could just stay
because you learned your lesson.
Exactly. Well,
those last 10 years, my bad.
I mean, the denazification was your clean bill of health, so to say. But there was this German expression also, which was called Perselschein, which was a ticket you got, or a figurative ticket you got once you received denazification, or during denazification, which was basically somebody had cleaned you. You know, it's like the laundering product Persol, made by this famous German industrialist family called Henkel. You know, you had a Persol ticket. You know, you had been cleaned.
You were inoculated.
You've been washed of all your Nazi sins, basically.
I'm so curious what those classes would have been. The denazification. They're like, hey, don't do genocide. They're like, oh, that's what we should have done. Is not genocide. That's a good point. Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I think the same thing happened in Japan post World War II. Are you familiar with, what is it, Unit 761?
No, I'm not.
Gabe, would you mind Googling this? I believe it's Unit 761. The number might be 731. This was basically a chemical warfare research and development unit in Imperial Japan, and it was devious. I mean, if anyone is interested, it's not for the faint of heart. I recommend reading the Wikipedia article. Deaths estimated up to 300,000, 400,000 or higher from biological warfare. I mean, just the extent of the inhumanity here was just beyond. I mean, doing live vivisection. I mean, there's things here that I won't read because we're going to get demonetized. But the true horrors of war you could imagine. And I believe the sort of leader and the medical head of the specific unit was given full immunity with trade of what he found.
Yeah.
And he was basically like, here's everything, and then died at like 80 years old or something like that. Are you able to go down to, I'm curious, maybe known unit members? Yeah. Known unit members is on the left there if you click that little part.
A lot of princes, a lot of aristocrats also involved.
Oh, yeah.
They're always involved.
Yeah, they got Prince in the front, in the name. Can you click this top guy? Yeah, I'm pretty sure. And then go down. Yeah, he died in 1959. But yeah, was ostensibly a war criminal that was able to trade some information,
including the bubonic plague attacks at Chinese cities. I had no idea.
Yeah,
they tried to release the bubonic plague.
Yeah,
wow,
crazy, right?
600 years on.
It's insane.
Yeah.
And you're just able to trade this stuff, which again, I just think is an interesting and an important thing when looking at history, that even when you're losing, you have leverage, and these folks, despite all of their atrocities, are able to be like, all right, this is what I have. And I always wondered, and that's an interesting point, if they know that they can hedge, if they know, like, look, I have something that they need, so I'm going to work with impunity, and we're going to try to win, but even if we lose, I'll still be okay, which is more insidious to me. Because they truly have no interest in like the ideological cause. It's purely self-interested.
Oh, absolutely.
Which you could almost argue is worse in a way.
This is something that I always pondered over the past few years, right? What's worse, the ideologues or the opportunists, right? Because there's one family in my book where they actually make this. They're such Nazi ideologues that they actually make business decisions which are bad for them. But in a way to benefit the Nazi party. So they merge a very profitable newspaper that they own with a Nazi publication that is bleeding money, and so they do it all in order to for the Nazi cause.
Yeah,
so to speak. So,
yeah, I mean, it's sort of splitting hairs with evil, but it is an interesting sort of moral, kind of philosophical question, right? Like, if you are enraptured in the ideology and the propaganda of a regime, and you believe it wholeheartedly, and you commit war crimes because of it, that is bad.
Right.
But then the person that doesn't believe it, but still commits war crimes because it benefits them, you could say it's worse. I don't know.
That's bad too.
I mean, of course, which one is worse is a fascinating question. But it's I think one worth considering. I want to discuss kind of the modern day and where some of these companies go to. But really quick, we're going to take a break just to hear from our sponsors that make this show possible. And maybe we'll run to the restroom as well. If you have any questions for David de Jong, please write those in the comments. We will check them out and we'll come back with a question. Thank you all so much, and we'll be back in just a couple seconds.
What's up, guys? We're going to take a break really quick because if you're anything like me, you're probably running late all the time. I am. I'm always leaving right when I'm supposed to be somewhere, and I never have time to sit down and grab a nutritious meal. And that's why I want to talk to you about this little product right here called Huel. Huel is absolutely amazing. It's got everything you need, all the essential vitamins and minerals, all the nutrients, all the protein you need in a regular meal, packaged in this beautiful, convenient little bottle. That's right. No more of the days of you running out the door being like, oh, I'll just grab some fast food or something. Oh, I'll have like, the leftover cheeseburger in the fridge. No. With Huel, it's healthy, nutritious, everything you need to power through the day, served in this little bottle right here. I mean, this has got 35 grams of protein, 7 grams of fiber, 27 vitamins and minerals. Everything's right on the back, and this will help you get through the day. It'll help you perform better, not only in the workplace, but also in the gym. I mean, at this point, I think they've sold over 400 million meals. I mean, is it 400 million? I mean, that's amazing. 400 million meals. So why not you? Take control of your health, be a little bit more time efficient, and get all the essentials that you need in every little bottle. If you're interested, go to Huel.com, use the promo code CAMP. That's Huel, Huel.com. Use the promo code CAMP and get 15% off your first order. Check it out right now. Get control of your health, get control of your life, and stop being so late. Let's just fix that also. Be on time, all right? Set an alarm. Let's get back to the show. What's up, guys? We're going to take a break really quick because testosterone is at an all-time low. I think that's a fact. I think on average, testosterone has never been lower. And I don't know if that's true or not. I think it is. And that's why I want to talk to you about Sculpt Nation. Sculpt Nation has introduced the Test Boost supplement. It's absolutely amazing. It's going to naturally boost your testosterone. And it's just got 8 clean, powerful, and natural supplements, all perfectly stacked in one little supplement. It's amazing. It's super easy to take, and it's got everything you need. Honestly, it's got like cordyceps mushroom, ashwagandha. These are things you could just buy at a supplement store, and I would recommend it. I think everyone should be taking this stuff. But with Sculpt Nation, they've put it all conveniently into a little supplement. So let them do the work, all right? And if you're interested in boosting your testosterone naturally, the clean way, right? Getting back to our primal roots as protectors and just dudes doing dude stuff, I would recommend you go to sculptnation.com/camp and save up to 51% off your first order of all natural testosterone boosting supplements. Again, it's everything you need, one little supplement. Sculpt Nation got it figured out. Trust them. They're the best. Anyway, let's get back to the show.
And we are back with David de Jong. We're live here discussing Nazi Billionaires, your book that you wrote, which is, again, fascinating. We have a question from MH. I'm sorry, dude. I don't know what your actual name is here. Similar to Porche, how did Hugo Boss avoid prosecution for implementation of slave labor during the 30s?
I mean, it goes back to all the other companies that have avoided any kind of repercussions following the war. Hugo Boss, everybody always asks me about Hugo Boss. I want to take the chance to also dispel it. I mean, Hugo Boss, yeah, they made uniforms for the SS and for the Nazi Party and for other paramilitary Nazi-affiliated groups. But the main family in my book, right, the Quandt dynasty, which controls BMW, or the BMW group today, which is not only BMW, but also Rolls-Royce and Mini, they, during the Third Reich, controlled a large battery brand called, which is today known as Varta, right? It's the brand which produces the batteries in your AirPods.
Oh, wow.
And they controlled one of the largest armaments producers in the Third Reich. And they were an even larger uniforms manufacturer during the Third Reich. And even before that, because they made their fortune producing uniforms for the military during World War I. And you never hear, I mean, everybody always focuses on Hugo Boss for some reason, but Hugo Boss, and there's no family attached to it today anymore, was really a comparatively minor player, but for some reason, everybody always latches on to Hugo Boss.
It's those shirts. It's you see some guy in the airport with a Hugo Boss shirt, and you're like, ugh, I don't like that guy. And then you try to figure out a reason why. You're like, oh, he's a Nazi. That's why. Yeah. Every time, I don't know. You see those Hugo Boss shirts, you're like, it's just gaudy. You know what I mean?
It is
Just
gaudy.
the giant.
The Hugo, right? The Boss or the Hugo. Well, I mean, who wants to walk around in that?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that is criminal in itself.
That is criminal. That should be. You got to go to Nuremberg for that one. The suits, though, that the Nazis had. I don't want to say it, but they were pretty sharp. The Hugo Boss did a decent job.
I'll leave that one up to you.
Unfortunately,
that one's all yours. Yeah.
That's fair. Yeah. I mean, compared to the shirts are just too much. But that's an interesting point. I mean, there's very many companies during this time. I mean, Coca-Cola created Fanta, I believe, in order to sell product to the Nazis. Is that true? Have you heard that before?
I have not heard that before.
Oh, Gabe, could you Google that? I had read this.
Heard that before.
Google Coca-Cola Fanta Nazis. Yeah, I believe like they wanted to distribute there. I mean, I might be. This is an AI overview, so we'll see if this is correct here. But yeah, Fanta was created in Nazi Germany during World War II as a Coca-Cola alternative. Oh, interesting. I don't know if it was created by Coca-Cola due to an American trade embargo that cut off supply. The Coca-Cola bottling company was loyal to Coca-Cola over his own country. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, I don't know if they were controlled or if they were just acquired later. But yeah, it seems like they were the soda or the cola of choice. It seems like in Nazi Germany. But there's so many of these types of brands. I think Bayer is another one.
Yeah, Bayer, yeah.
Bayer.
Yeah.
They used to be, what is it?
IG Farben. Bayer came out of IG Farben, which was the largest pharmaceuticals and chemicals conglomerate. And actually their entire executive board was sentenced at Nuremberg.
I mean, they created a version or the whole, chemical makeup of Zyklon B.
That is a joint venture between IG Farben and Degussa. Which was another chemical company.
I mean,
yeah, but Bayer was the pharmaceutical branch because not the only company which was broken up by the Allies after, or one of the few companies which was broken up by the Allies after the war was IG Farben. Right, there's this very famous picture. Maybe you can pull it up of IG Farben, the IG Farben octopus. Which
IG Farben octopus. Could you pull that up? Yeah.
There's a famous
and it's an actual photograph?
It's a photograph by I think an American illustrator which shows kind of the
what is it? IG you said octopus?
Yeah, it shows it as an octopus or like where it has its tentacles and everything.
Oh, interesting.
No.
All right. I don't know if we'll be able to find it. All right, Gabe, you try to pull it up. We'll continue here.
So IG Farben, right, was broken up after the war into three companies. One being Bayer, which is still one of the largest chemical companies, pharmaceutical companies today, and the other is BASF, which is one of the largest chemical companies today. And one Heirs, which is not that relevant anymore, but their entire executive board was one of the three industrialist trials at Nuremberg, and so they were sentenced, and their sentences were commuted along with many other the industrialists that were sentenced at Nuremberg by the U.S. Commissioner for Occupied Germany, a man named John J. McCloy, who did this out of political expedient reasons, because by 1950, and the Korean War starts, for initially Truman and then Eisenhower enacts the so-called War Defense Act, which has American factories producing only armaments for the Korean War, and there's a huge consumer gap. There's a huge gap in consumer demand for consumer products, and West Germany is like the key ally, which is able to newly reindustrialize, which is able to fill that consumer gap and produce products, and you have the then German Chancellor, which says to which says initially to Truman and then to Eisenhower, oh, if you want us to be your full partner and your full ally, you're keeping our men locked up, on our territory. So we want to have, we want them to be free. So what ends up happening is not only some of the high-ranking industrialists who are released, the Nuremberg convicted industrialists who are released, but you have many high-ranking SS officers who oversaw the murder of hundreds of thousands, whose death sentences are commuted to life sentences and are then, by the mid-1950s, are commuted to freedom, are released, and are back on the streets of Germany. And they then start working for, say, Porche, or as the marketing director after overseeing the murders on the East Front of hundreds of thousands. Yeah.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah.
That is wild.
Yeah.
I just assumed all the really, really bad guys, they're in prison. They got put to death.
Well, some of them did. Some of them you couldn't avoid of being sentenced to death and actually hanged. But many of them who had done, who had committed equally great, equally mass scale genocidal crimes.
Wow. And we mentioned this term before. I mentioned rather leverage. These people are doing evil things, but they have something that, the Allies want in this new war.
Yeah.
And so they're able to negotiate. This is just what happened, rightly or wrongly. This is what they did. I'm curious, why did some industrialists have less leverage than others? Why did the auto manufacturers seem to get off fairly leniently, whereas others, they were actually sentenced and then later commuted?
I mean, it was more the power. The more powerful you were, right? I mean, the more leverage you had, basically. But the more powerful you were, also put you in the crosshairs of ended up at Nuremberg. So the three industrialist trials, at Nuremberg, in addition to the executive board of IG Farben, is the Flick trial, Friedrich Flick, which is one of the main families in the book too, the main dynasties in the book. He later came to become the controlling shareholder of Daimler-Benz. But during the Third Reich, he oversaw the largest steel, coal, and armaments conglomerate, and was the largest profiteer of so-called Aryanization, so the expropriation of Jewish-owned businesses, and also the largest the largest purveyor or exploiter of forced and slave labor among the private industrialists, or as a private citizen, or as somebody who owns a namesake conglomerate. Of the 120,000 employees that he had, I think by 1944, more than half were, of the 120,000 laborers that he had by early 1944, more than half were forced and slave laborers.
Wow. That's a point that I actually feel like, for me at least, was underrepresented in my understanding of World War II history. I think in my mind it was okay, there's a military component, there's an sort of an aggressive war effort, there's a genocide component, of course. But the forced labor component, I just feel like maybe I'm ignorant. It never exactly came up. Can you explain how that came to be, what that looked like, and who was doing the labor and how was that organized?
So, of course, as World War II develops, right? I mean, there's all German men are called, or all German able-bodied men are drafted and called to the front, right? So there's a huge absence, or there's a huge shortage of labor. So what happens is the largest forced labor program that the world had ever seen to date, which saw the deportation of 12 to 20 million Europeans from all across the continent, who were rounded up and to be exploited in German factories and mines, right? Of that estimated 12 to 20 million, about 2 million died in German factories and mines. Which is a huge proportion, because they had to work under the most horrific of circumstances. Now, even there, in the forced and slave labor, there was a hierarchy kind of a perverse hierarchy where you had, for example, Western European or Nordic forced laborers from the Netherlands, from Denmark, from other Scandinavian countries, which were considered closer to the, Aryan ideals of the Nazis. So they were treated comparatively, in many cases, comparatively, relatively okay, particularly in terms, particularly compared to the other forced and slave laborers. Sometimes they would receive a bit of money, but they were still, they were rounded up in the streets of the occupied territories and were shipped off to Germany, including my own grandfather, who tried to sail to England with his best friend, and he was a very avid sailor and was blown back to shore, and was arrested by German soldiers because he wanted to join. So they sailed to England to join the Royal Air Force, and he ended up being arrested and sentenced as a political prisoner to 20 months in a German factory, or to 20 months in German prison, and he ended up being exploited as a slave laborer in a steel factory in the German Ruhr area, the industrial area. And, he was 6'5", and he came out weighing 100 pounds. And, he barely survived. And he was lapped up, and, he was recovered in a Swiss sanatorium. And soon thereafter married my grandmother, who was his neighbor. Wow. But these are, he was a Dutch guy, Protestant, 25. He was from 1916, so he was. I guess when he was arrested, he was 25 when he was arrested, and so they were on the top of the forced and slave labor totem pole. So as it were, and he barely survived already, right? Just to keep that in mind.
Wow.
Now below that you had the prisoners of, you had the so-called laborers from the East, Ostarbeiter, as the Nazis called them, which were deported from from Ukraine, from Russia, from all the Eastern countries, and they were treated very poorly because they belonged to the according to what the Nazis saw as the degenerate Slavic race, and they were horrifically treated, right? But they were most of them were treated were deported as forced laborers, and the difference between forced and slave labor is that those who were forced, they were coerced, they were rounded up, they were arrested, but they received some sort of payment, not of course on par with the German employees. They received much less, but they were forced, but they were paid, and slave laborers were literally enslaved and did not receive any kind of payment. So those were the Ostarbeiters. It was a huge category. It was about 6 to 10 million people. And then beneath there was the prisoners of war, Soviet prisoners of war, many other prisoners of war, who were slave laborers and were, treated horrifically, were executed summarily. And of course, at the bottom of the totem pole were concentration camp captives, whether Jewish or otherwise, who were leased out. I mean, it's so perverse to say, but were leased out to the SS, by the SS, who run the concentration camps, to German factories and German companies. And there were these kind of collaborations. I mean, there's no other way to put it. Collaborations between, you had BMW and Dachau, you had Auschwitz and IG Farben, you had Volkswagen with several concentration camps nearby, who made these deals with the SS. These companies did, where they would lease concentration camp captives from the SS, so they would pay the SS. Of course, the slave laborers didn't receive a penny, where they would receive 4 Reichsmark per day, or the companies would pay the SS 4 Reichsmark a day to lease an unskilled concentration camp captive, and they would pay the SS 8 Reichsmark per day for a skilled concentration camp captives. And of course, this led to the so-called the establishment of these satellite or sub-concentration camps on the premises of German companies or German factory complexes or near German mines.
Wow. So it's a gulag effect.
It is a gulag.
I had no idea of this.
Yeah.
Wow.
It was a huge operation and many companies participated in that, including the companies controlled by Günther Quandt, which is one of the main characters in the book, and Friedrich Flick, and companies like Volkswagen, BMW, IG Farben, Siemens, Krupp. And
they were
many
fully
others.
aware of the nature of the labor.
Absolutely. They were on the factory premises, right? They would erect. The SS would be responsible for building a concentration camp on a factory complex, and they would also then were tasked by protecting the factory, right? So and they would get from, say, an Auschwitz or a Ravensbrück or a Dachau or any of the other concentration camps would basically get thousands or hundreds or thousands of concentration camp captives, would deport them over to factory complexes where they were, exploited under the most horrific circumstances imaginable, right? And that is, for example, what Ferdinand Porche and Anton Piach did at the Volkswagen factory. I mean, there were still a sliver. I mean, we're talking about thousands of concentration camp captives as slave laborers among tens of thousands of forced laborers at a factory complex like that. But it would be the same at Günther Quandt's AFA battery factories, right? Or at Friedrich Flick's steel and coal and armaments factories.
Wow. I had no idea of that. And again, we're talking about at this time, this notion of total war, where
Right.
all of these industries are now focused on this war effort. So I'm curious, and not that it makes a ton of a difference, to be honest, but were they, like these forced laborers, were they working on, I guess, like automobiles for these automobile manufacturers, or were they working on armaments and weapons?
No, they were working on armaments and weapons because it was it was
total war.
It was total. There was no consumer production, right?
But they still benefited financially from this.
Yes, they would because you had the regime, which, well, again, until February 1943, when the economic tide is turning
Right.
Against the Nazi regime.
But they're getting paid by the Nazi regime.
They are,
and
they
then
are by
they're
the SS or by its subsidiaries.
and then they're paying a very small fee to the SS to get the labor.
exactly
And
exactly
that arbitrage, they're obviously making.
right. Exactly. The
millions and
delta
millions.
is they're making off of that. Yeah.
Wow.
But I mean, again, the question also goes to how effective are these forced enslaved? You are rounded up people or have deported them in from concentration camps, right? I mean, these people are already deeply malnourished. They're there, they're imprisoned, they're horribly treated. Again, so how much of effective labor are we talking about, right? I mean, this is not. The question also is how production-wise, how much sense did it actually make? I mean, it was really destruction through labor. I mean, that was literally the motto of some of these companies and the SS. It was just that they could literally work them to death.
Destruction through labor. Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, that is even more insidious. Like,
Yeah.
you can see the financial thing and say, okay, look, they were, immoral, but they had a financial means. Destruction through labor is just, hey, give them something to do until they die. I mean, it's like truly disturbing. And so the Quandt family, that's another character that comes up in the book.
Yeah.
Can you just detail the, I guess, sort of the main family member there and what they did and what their association with the National Socialists were?
Totally. So Günther Quandt was the patriarch of the Quandt dynasty, which today is the Quandt dynasty is considered to be the wealthiest and kind of most influential business dynasty in Germany. One branch today controls the BMW group. It's two siblings, actually. They control 47% of the BMW group. They're the richest siblings in Germany. They have an estimated net worth of 60 billion. And they get about a 1 billion dividend each every year from BMW. And the other branch stems from, which is the quote unquote poor branch, is still multi-billionaires too, but don't control BMW Group, stem from Magda Gobbels, or who ends up becoming Magda Gobbels, because Günter Quandt, who during the Third Reich controls this massive battery factory, then known as AFA, today known as Varta, as well as this massive armaments company. His second marriage is to a young woman called, known as Magda Ritschl, and after the divorce becomes known to the world as the First Lady of the Third Reich through her marriage to Nazi Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels. And the marriage between Günter Quandt and Magda Goebbels produces one son, Harald. He has one son from his first marriage, Günter Quandt does, called Herbert Quandt. The Herbert Quandt branch ends up owning the BMW Group, or controlling the BMW Group. And the Harald Quandt branch ends up owning a 15% stake in Daimler-Benz, which then is sold to the Kuwaitis, and then they've been investing that money since.
Wow. So Günter Quandt is married to Magda Goebbels.
Before
right.
she becomes Magda Goebbels. Yeah.
They get divorced, and then she marries Joseph Goebbels.
Yes.
Wow. I mean, that's a bad ex-wife.
That is
like, if you want to talk about ex-wives.
Exactly. Especially what she ends up doing, right? With the murder of her 6 children in the Führer bunker in April 30th, 1945.
So she is a proper ideologue. She has no desire to flee. Like
he's such a fascinating character, because her high school boyfriend is this man named Chaim Arlosoroff, who later becomes one of the largest Zionist immigrants to the British Mandate of Palestine, and becomes if you go to Tel Aviv, there's all these streets. There's one of the main streets is named after Arlosoroff, and that is Magda Goebbels, or then Magda Friedlander, Magda Ritschl's high school boyfriend, is one of the most important Zionists. And is eliminated under very murky circumstances in February 1930 in 1933, actually, on a beach at Tel Aviv, which has never been cleared up. So that's her first boyfriend. Then she ends up married as a 17-year-old. She meets the 39-year-old industrialist Günter Quandt and marries him, which is a total mismatch of a marriage. But he's one of Germany's most powerful industrialists, recently widowed, is enamored with Magda Goebbels, becomes enamored with Magda Ritschl, who actually has a Jewish stepfather as well at the time. They produce that marriage produces one son, Günter Quandt, and the Quandt dynasty become the most powerful business dynasty in Germany. And then she ends up in 1931 falling head over heels to Joseph Goebbels, right? Who was kind of this unsightly gnome-looking figure, and they, of course, become kind of the most talked about, most known couple in Nazi Germany, because Hitler is also in love with Magda Goebbels, but he says, I need to be celibate. I'm married to the German people, because he has this covert relationship to Eva Braun, And so they have this kind of platonic arrangement called the arrangement, where Joseph and Magda Goebbels are his should be to the German people kind of the propaganda, what a nuclear family should look like. 6 blonde children. So Harald Quandt is, and also again Magda Goebbels' son from her first marriage to Günter Quandt. Is abused basically as a propaganda prop by Hitler and Goebbels to show what a young Aryan boy or a strong male should look like. And he actually never joins the Nazi party. Harald Quandt does, because he has this kind of he becomes this paratrooper, German paratrooper, and it's the only one of Magda Goebbels' children who survives the war, because while she murders her 6 children in the Führer bunker, he's in a British prisoner of war camp after being arrested in Italy at the end of the war, because he was again a paratrooper that would be shot into behind enemy lines and would do operations there.
Wow. And why does he never join the Nazi party?
Because he was basically kind of a spoiled rich kid who wasn't really interested in joining who had no interest in Nazi ideology.
Wow.
And gets away with it because his stepfather is Joseph Goebbels.
Wow.
Yeah.
And does he distance himself from sort of the Nazi politics and his mother's legacy later?
So interestingly enough, during the war, he's very clear to his mother and his stepfather, where he says, the war is being lost, right? I mean, he's serving at the Eastern Front. He can see what's happening, right? Like Germany's losing the war, which is, of course, something that his propaganda stepfather does not want to hear. So he's very clear. He's very aware that Germany is losing the war. And, later in life, of course, due to the tragic death of suicide of his mother, stepfather, and, of course, their murder of his 6 step-siblings, or half-siblings, he's very reluctant to talk about the war, and he's totally traumatized. And I think the only thing he says about it is that, he never forgives his mother and stepfather for murdering his 6 half-siblings. And but he also becomes, together with his half-brother Herbert, they become the two of the most dominant industrialists of post-war Germany.
Wow. I mean, Magda Gobbels, that is a fascinating and morbid story.
Yeah, but this was a woman who was really out for power, right?
But just the murder of her own children, I mean, for a mother to kill her own kids is truly pathological.
Well, totally. Oh, totally. Totally.
Beyond, like, even just having a child now after like 6 or 7 weeks, seeing the way my wife is with our baby, I mean, it is such a primal protective instinct.
Totally.
The idea of what she did. Why did she not try to flee or broker a deal? Like, is there any speculation on that?
Well, no, there is. I mean, Günther Quandt offers her kind of this refuge, offers his ex-wife saying, you can flee, I will pay for you to flee to Switzerland, But she has hung herself up so, she's tied herself so closely to Hitler and the Nazi cause that there's no way out. And she, in this very fatalistic, totally nihilist way, she says, if we were dying for our fatherland, and she writes this very emotional letter from the Führer bunker to Harold. She does as though Joseph Goebbels just before she murders her 6 children and commits suicide with her husband. Saying we're the children. There would be no life for the children to live on after Germany falls, and kind of rationalizing her decisions. It's totally perverse.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, and did they recover, this is a morbid detail, I don't know if you even know the answer to this, did they recover her body and his body?
They do. There's pictures of them made by Soviet soldiers after, and don't look those up.
Yeah, no thank you.
Yeah, because she gives cyanide to her 6 children, right? Famously, right? She has them kind of, or the doctor in the Führer bunker administers the cyanide, and Magda says, and then because these are capsules, so they has to break them, right? So that's one thing, and then she and Goebbels go up into the garden of the Reichschancellery, right, which is completely destroyed. And then they take cyanide, and then Goebbels has asked an aide to shoot them so that they're sure they're dead, and then set their bodies on fire, ablaze. So that is how they are discovered by Soviet soldiers, a few days later. And
when you say the Führer bunker, they're in
the heart of Berlin, in the below the Reichschancellery, or the garden of the Reichschancellery, really.
Is the same place where Hitler is?
Exactly, same place where Hitler is. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Have you ever seen the movie? It's called Der Untergang. It's really famous for memes that there's The Downfall. It's called. Pull it up because it won an Oscar for depicting kind of the scenes at the the scene inside the Führer bunker as the Nazi Empire, as the Nazi Germany falls in its last weeks. It's a really excellent movie, and I can very much recommend you watching it.
Wow.
Yeah, this is it. Yeah, Der Untergang.
Oh, it's a German film?
Yeah.
Oh wow.
But it's subtitled.
Right.
It's well known. It's won an Oscar, and it's really, I can very much recommend it to watch it.
Wow.
It's 20 years old.
I mean, I couldn't even imagine. Like on the one hand, it's just like a tragic society, like just the collapse of humanity in those moments is so morbid, and bizarre. And I need to ask. I mean, every time I discuss World War II history, there's always a comment where people go, "Did Hitler escape?"
Right.
I'm curious if you've read into this at all.
I mean, no. He didn't escape. He got, he killed himself together with Eva Braun, and shot himself, and took cyanide, then shot her, then shot himself.
Right.
And that's it. So all those. He's not living in South America.
Right, as the legend goes, as people speculate.
That is an untrue speculation.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, even just hearing the story of Magda and Joseph Goebbels, the brutality again kind of leads me to think like, oh, there probably was, Hitler's downfall was likely the same thing. If they did it, Hitler certainly.
Yeah. So they survived. So Joseph Goebbels ends up serving as one day as Chancellor of Germany following Hitler's suicide. He appoints his closest kind of support, aide or supporter. And Hitler gives his golden pin to Magda Goebbels as a kind of a last tribute to her, to her support. And
wow.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a theory that the Soviets, got Hitler's remains, and that they were, again, this is just as the theory goes.
Right.
I'm just explaining
Sure.
to you the broad theory.
Sure.
That there was a test that was done in like the early 2000s on the skull, and they discovered that it was the skull of like a 30-year-old woman is what the story is, and then it was never looked at after that. Is that true? I can't say, but this is where I think the legend comes from.
Yeah, where the legend starts. The legend of his escape to South America.
Right. I mean, many. I guess I shouldn't say many, but certainly some SS officers did escape to South America.
For sure, of course. And there's really good books written about it, like The Red Line by Philip Sands. That is absolutely true.
Yeah.
That is absolutely true. And of course, the families I write about didn't have to flee, right? They could just stay.
Right.
And somebody like Günter Quandt, for example, later after the war, in his denazification trials, uses his antagonistic relationship with Joseph Goebbels as an excuse to say, well, actually, I was persecuted by the Nazis, and use it as his plea to go off scot-free, which ends up happening, right? He's only deemed a fellow traveler. Mind you, Günter Quandt was one of the largest industrialists of the Third Reich, who exploits about almost 60,000 forced and slave laborers, including thousands of concentration camp captives. And is one of the largest profiteers of Aryanization, expropriates many companies in occupied territories, and is also one of the largest armaments producers. And he goes scot-free in denazification trials. And his son, Herbert Quandt, who ends up saving BMW from bankruptcy and becoming also a legendary industrialist figure. Today, BMW has named a foundation after him called the BMW Foundation Herbert Quandt, with a motto saying, "Inspire responsible leadership," of a man who, exactly, that's it. We believe in the power of collaboration with the Nazis. Of a man, Herbert Quandt was somebody who built a sub-concentration camp in German-occupied Poland, exploited thousands of forced and slave laborers in a Berlin battery factory, including hundreds of female concentration camp captives from Auschwitz, acquired companies stolen from Jews in France. And today you have a massive foundation named after him by BMW, without any mention of his Nazi war, his past as a Nazi war criminal. And that is really the reason why I wrote this book, is to show this kind of whitewashing and this kind of hypocrisy, and make people aware also of the need for historical transparency by some of the world's wealthiest and most powerful families.
Wow. Yeah, I want to jump to the modern day and examine sort of where these dynasties went and the wealth that they've continued to accrue.
Yeah.
Before that, I actually want to ask, and I think it's an important distinction, the Aryanization of industry is another detail about World War II that I don't know if gets brought up often, which, correct me if I'm wrong, effectively you have businesses that are controlled and operated by non-Aryans, many of which Jews.
Yeah.
And when there is effectively a cleansing and there is a push to Aryanize all these industries, have them be controlled by proper German pure blood men. They round up and kick out, entrap all these non-Aryans that are controlling these industries, which of course is a massive transfer of wealth. You have an entire industries, I'm sure, controlled by specific groups of people that now have nothing. Many of them are killed, and then all of that wealth gets transferred to these people that are effectively have no claim to it. I just think that's an interesting detail that never really gets brought up, or at least I don't hear about it as much.
No, so the practice of Aryanization, right, which is also this perversely cynic term, which denotes the wholesale expropriation mainly of Jewish-owned assets, right? Initially, have this. It starts with the firing of board members or supervisory board members from 1933 onwards by German company of executives of Jewish descent, but it quickly devolves into, as the persecution of German Jews ramps up, devolves into the so-called practice of Aryanization, which initially is as this veneer of legality, right, where competitors or Nazi authorities coerce entrepreneurs or business families to sell their assets at a fire sale price, or they want to sell it because they want to gather the means to get the hell out of the country. Mm-hmm. But as the persecution ramps up in the second half of the 1930s, you really have it just devolves into outright theft and robbery, which is a practice, of course, that continues also with businesses in German occupied territories, be they Aryan or non-Aryan, right? So it becomes this kind of tried and true method in which it becomes attractive for industrialists to acquire competitors on the cheap, or acquire foreign competitors on the cheap in German occupied territories.
Wow.
So it's really, and then it's mainly called expropriation. It doesn't have the Aryan, non-Aryan factor. But Aryanization is this, is really again a perversely cynic term, which is the removal of any trace of Jewish ownership from any asset, whether that is company shares, bonds, real estate, artworks, diamonds, you name it, anything of relative value, until it, of course, devolves into anything of basic value.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I think an important detail when looking at the atrocities of World War II that I feel like is not always highlighted. I believe a similar thing happened in Uganda under Idi Amin, if I'm not mistaken. I hope I'm getting my details here. But effectively, there was like a class, like a minority class that controlled certain industries in Uganda at the time. And he basically gave, I think there were like Southeast Asian, like Indian, Pakistani descent, and effectively gave them a date and said, you have to leave the country and abandon all your industry and turn it over to, our government by this date, or you'll get killed.
Wow.
And so
that's in a way that's even more brutal, because again, Aryanization initially has this veneer of legality, right?
Right. Oh, we'll buy it from you. Which,
exactly. Or you have to sell it, or else we will take your company, basically. I recently did a big investigation for Vanity Fair, which took me a year and a half, about what is currently Germany's richest man named Klaus-Michael Küne, who is 87, has an estimated net worth of 44 billion, and doesn't have any heirs. And his family profited off of the so-called M-Aktion, which was the furniture action, which was the Kühne Nagel, which is the company that he controls, is one of the largest freight forwarders in in the world, and they transported all of the looted goods of families that had been deported to extermination of concentration camps. Küne would transport them from the Netherlands, from France, from Belgium, from Luxembourg to Germany. So they would empty the houses after people had been put on trams to the gas chambers, and they would empty the houses, or they would transport the goods from Germany, from the occupied territories to Germany to be either auctioned off or handed out to families whose houses had been destroyed by Allied bombings, etc. And his father and uncle, Klaus-Michael Küne's father and uncle, had made this deal with the Nazi authorities to profit or to execute or to use Küne and Nagel as the freight forwarder of these looted goods of murdered families. And he refuses today to own up to that history. He commissioned a study which he shelved after it included a chapter on his companies and his father's and his uncle's Nazi history and Nazi activities. And it's going to be one of because he's heirless, it's going to be one of the largest after he dies. And the 44 billion is a low estimate. After he dies, his entire fortune will go to a foundation, and it will be, as big as it will be one of the world's largest charities, and with no kind of reckoning or recourse regarding its brutal Nazi history.
Wow, this guy had no kids.
No, he got married at 50.
Bizarre.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that is an excellent. Greater moral question that I think a lot of people are probably wondering. So you have all of these families that have profited off of this genocide, atrocity, war, whatever you want to call it, and now the heirs have carried on that wealth, grown the wealth ostensibly. This book, I kind of wish came out in 1950. I think it would have been like, oh, let's shine a light there. Unfortunately, you were not born yet. You were just
I'm a late 80s guy. This is 40 years on.
You were late. That's
exactly. I was late.
So it's one of these questions to say, okay, what do we do now? Right? We have BMW. All these companies you have named that are obviously massive players in global industry today, with children probably, or grandchildren, or grandnephews, or maybe even people not related at all to these families that did these terrible things. What is their responsibility morally? Should they carry the sins of their father? Is there a reparation system? What is the best framework to look at this?
They shouldn't carry the sins of their father, but what they should do is what I'm arguing for is not to donate money or anything. It's just to be transparent about history. That's the least one can ask, right? Is if you so have to name, your major global charitable foundations, museums, academic chairs, media prizes, you name it, after men who committed mass war crimes, then at least own up to it. And not whitewash it, because, these families and these companies, I would say, have a responsibility to be transparent about history at the minimum, right? Is to show history for what it is, is to show the good and the bad. And we live in this era, right, of good corporate governance, apparently. Where these companies, where it would be kind of good governance to say, hey, our founder, our largest shareholder, our owning family did horrific things to the Third Reich, in the Third Reich, but we're coming clean with that. And this is what he did. We're showing both sides of it. Because you can only learn from history by showing the good and the bad. If you only show the good, it's just a whitewash. It's just a distortion of the past.
Interesting. So this foundation, like the Quandt Foundation, for example, if they were to say, hey, look, history is complicated. Our ancestor did terrible, atrocious things, but also helped our business grow and is, intrinsic to the business. And we're not going to, just erase them from the history of our business. So what we're going to try to do is
make the best of an awful and criminal situation,
Yeah.
and in his name donate to XYZ charities in the hope of creating a better future and atoning for what we've done. Like, would that be satisfactory or appropriate?
Well, again, with the caveat that as long as you're transparent about the full history, right, and not try to whitewash it, not try to gloss over it, right, because because for some reason these heirs, these billionaire heirs, who are stewarding these, $40-50 billion fortunes, have shaped their entire identity as heirs, and find it incredibly difficult of disavowing publicly their fathers and grandfathers, because what is left of their own identity then, basically? I mean, I reached out to all these families that I write about in the book, and only one of them, they either declined to be interviewed, or declined to comment, or their spokespeople, gave such answers which were non-answers. And only one grandson of Friedrich Flick, whose grandson is 80 now, I had it on the record email correspondence with him, and he said, yes, many bad things have come out about my grandfather, mind you. This grandfather was convicted in Nuremberg for war crimes and crimes against humanity, but he gave us so much more than wealth alone. So there is this, he was quite candid, but even there's a complete lack of distancing. And I think in this day and age, I think, again, being transparent about our history, not glossing over it, but now what they're doing is championing Nazi war criminals without being, yes, successful businessmen, but yes, also Nazi war criminals, without being transparent about the Nazi part. And I think that's where the rub is that they should, these companies and these families are so concerned with protecting the myth of the brand, right? Protecting the myth of BMW, of Porsche, of Audi, of all these big car brands, that they're so afraid to hurt the share price or the sales or the standing of these brands. That is another aspect of why they're refusing to fess up to history. They're refusing to be transparent on a global consumer-facing level about who these men were that made these companies, that made these brands what they are today, which is some of the world's most recognizable brands.
Right. Now, you had mentioned, I forget, you had given a talk, I believe, where you had mentioned that there were certain families that profited greatly and then kind of disappeared, that sort of divested and kind of moved away with their fortune and are no longer major global economic players. Could you touch on that and sort of why you think it is important to address the current global players and not necessarily, focus on these other folks that profited from the conflict that have now gone away?
Yeah, so I mean, I really focus on the book is kind of the contemporary reasons why I chose these five dynasties in the book, is that they still have to be, they still have to either have a consumer-facing company like BMW or Porsche or Volkswagen. They still have to be relevant in global business, basically. Or they have to have family offices which invest billions in private equity, art, you name it, real estate. But they still have to be, one of the conditions they need to be relevant in global business today. And secondly is these dynasties have to live on, right? They still have to exist. There has to be a next generation, because there needs to be some kind of reckoning or recourse, right? At least in the book. But with a guy like Klaus-Michael Küne, who doesn't have any heirs, right? That's why he's not in the book. That's why it became a standalone piece for Vanity Fair. It's because the reckoning needs to happen now, or it needs to happen with this foundation before it becomes one of the world's largest foundations in the world. And the third condition is, I really wanted to focus on those families which have effective economic control over their companies. They have a say in the policy or of where the company is going, right? Because, for example, the BMW group is controlled effectively by two people who are Germany's wealthiest siblings, each a net worth of estimated 30 billion, and they own 47% of the BMW group. Right, so they have effective economic control over the companies. But if you talk about a company like Siemens, for example, right, where you have 200, 300, 400, 500, 600 shareholders, it's so diffuse, the ownership. You don't really they don't really steward the company in one way or another. So they don't really can make the decisions that end up, either affecting company, the direction of a company, but also saying, hey, we are not going to, we are stopping the whitewashing of history, and we're going to fess up to our history. Say which companies controlled, like by the Quandt dynasty with BMW, or the Porche Pierre dynasty with Porsche and Audi and Volkswagen, have a say in it, because they only have two dozen shareholders, and they're very much involved. They are the controlling shareholders, which, if you're talking about hundreds of shareholders, they have not, right? And as I mentioned earlier, these dynasties that have gone away, like the Krupp, the famous Krupp steel dynasty, or the Thyssen steel dynasty, they don't have any heirs anymore. So these families don't play a relevant role in the companies anymore. Either in the case of Krupp, it was left to a 25% stake was left to a major global to the Krupp Foundation. And the Thyssen dynasty literally moved to the Pampas in Argentina and no longer play a role of relevance in global business. It is important to focus on those which are really still have skin in the game, as it were, because they can actually make changes for the good, or for the bad. But at the end of the book, I also give a counterexample of a family called the Reimanns, which have this really crazy story. And the Reimann is kind of is Germany's new wealthiest dynasty, and they control most of the American consumer goods like Snapple, 7-Up, Krispy Kreme donuts, Einstein Bros bagels, Keurig Green Mountain, Panera Bread, and many other. Jimmy Choo, many other, consumer brands, particularly in the U.S., right? And they had this father and grandfather who were virulent anti-Semites, ardent Nazi sympathizers, served in their local municipality for the Nazi Party. But their grandfather, actually, from the other side, from their maternal side, was actually a Jewish man named Alfred Landecker, who was murdered during the Holocaust. So they stem from both perpetrator and victim. And they only found all of this out in 2019. And the New York Times ended up writing a lot about it too, where they didn't know about this history. So they were confronted with this in 2019 after Bild, which is Germany's largest tabloid, wrote about the dark history of Germany's newly wealthiest dynasty. And then 3 months later, they came out with an interview in the New York Times saying, yes, our father and grandfather, all from our father's side, were major Nazis, but the father of our mother, our maternal grandfather, was a Jewish man who was murdered in the Holocaust. So they actually ended up putting their money where their mouth is and renaming their foundation, named after their father, to their murdered grandfather, and endowing it in perpetuity with 250 million euros, which is a huge, enormous amount.
Wow. And
doing very cutting-edge research on, discrimination, racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, etc., and still being transparent about who their father and grandfather were, i.e., huge Nazis.
So you would say they handled it effectively.
They handled it well. So I give them at the end of the book as a counterexample, right? But of course, that's a unique situation.
Yeah,
where,
of course.
Like, you stem from both victim and perpetrator. I mean, that rarely happens.
I mean, what a bizarre, morbidly ambiguous,
Totally.
situation to be in as the child, to say my great grandparents stemmed on completely opposite sides.
Totally. Yeah. And it gets even crazier because their father was married. That marriage remained childless, but on the side, he has this affair with this woman. They have 3 children, and that woman's father was actually one who ended up murdered in the Holocaust, and those children become the controlling shareholders of all these, American consumer companies.
Wow. Yeah, but also maybe like a beautiful kind of show of unity, that like these two oppositional, forces, like the victim and the aggressor. they were able to find some unity and were able to, rename the foundation and, use these funds for something good.
Yeah, in the end, yeah. But I would say that the other business families or the other companies that I write about in my book could take an example out of the way they handled it so far.
Yeah, I want to ask about the families that have like a very one-sided, history and what they should do. Additionally, like expounding this to the greater conversation of, there's, I don't know if there's any necessarily a nation that is, purely clean.
Absolutely not.
And very
Absolutely
few
not.
corporations that have been around, over 100 years that have, sort of no misdeeds. And, if they should also follow suit, I think it's an interesting question. But really quick, we're just going to hear from our sponsors. Additionally, anyone that's, listening right now, we're live with David de Jong. If you have any questions regarding this topic, please drop them into the comment section. We'll be checking them out during the break, and we'll come back with a question as well as all the other questions that I just mentioned. Thank you guys so much. We'll be back in just a minute.
What's up, guys? We're going to take a break really quick because I want to help you make sports more fun. That's right. If you like watching sports, there's a way to make it 10 times more fun, and that is with Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the largest independently owned daily fantasy sports platform in North America. It's absolutely super fun and super easy to play. All you got to do is pick 2 to 6 player stats and hit more or less, and you can watch the winnings roll in. And to be honest with you, I'm pretty good. I've been winning some money, but I've lost more. I'll be honest. I'm bleeding money right now. I'm terrible at this game. I know nothing about sports. I'm awful. I always click more or less on the wrong things. So whatever I do the exact opposite of. Apparently, people are winning money on this. There's some people that are making, they turn $10 into $1,000 in just a few taps. Not me. Maybe you could figure it out. So if you want to play Prize Picks, go to the App Store, download the Prize Picks app on your mobile device, use the promo code CAMP, C-A-M-P. And with your first $5 lineup, you will get $50 instantly deposited into your account that you are able to play with. That's right. I mean, here I am, giving the good people some funds to play with. So, you're welcome. Well, let's get back to the show.
And we're back. Just want to say thanks again to Prize Picks for making this show possible. Obviously, today is Monday, so we got some sports tonight. Again, I don't know anything about this. I'm terrible at sports. I'm terrible at this game, okay? But I'm going to say Lamar Jackson. I'm going moron. Justin Herbert. I'm going to say more. And J.K. Dobbins. J.K., I mean, just having the first name is just kidding. That's going to make me lose confidence. I'm going to go less on that, to be completely frank. Again, knowing virtually nothing about, I think this is football. I'm pretty sure this is football. If you guys want to play along, absolutely, by all means, you can go to Prize Picks, download the app on your smart device, or click on the link in the description. Thank you again for Prize Picks for making the show possible. Again, we are here with David de Jong. We're live discussing his book, Nazi Billionaires and the Dynasties. They got rich in Germany, but also, I guess, across all of the Third Reich. This question comes from Audrey Hans. He asks, and I think this is pointed at you, okay? This is racial.
I'm ready.
Okay,
I'm ready.
I apologize in
I'm
advance.
ready. That's okay.
You as a Dutchman.
Forgiven.
You as a Dutchman, people are asking who the collaborating Dutch were that got richer from the war. What about that, David?
Yeah, no, it's totally fair to point scrutiny at my own people. Particularly, I would say a brand which is very well known, which has a kind of ambiguous status in the Netherlands regarding its war time, is Philips, the large electronics maker. Because on one hand, they were able to save a lot of concentration camp captives that before of deportation to the concentration and extermination camps. On the other hand, they also had their own satellite, or a subsidiary had their own satellite concentration camp just over the border in Germany, where thousands of concentration camp captives were exploited as slave laborers. So it is often, that there is this kind of, it's gray skills, right? I mean, they, in many ways, they tried, in that case, they tried to do, or the Philips family tried to do something good, but also ended up, brutally exploiting thousands of concentration camp captives. So there is this kind of ambiguity of trying to save people, but at the same time, brutally exploiting others.
Yeah. I think it, again, raises just the point that we talked about right before the break. What do we do with any of these corporations? Like, do you believe that this scrutiny that is being applied to obviously this war, this tragedy, and all the families that got rich from it, should it apply to all tragedy, right? Like war profiteering is
As
it's
time, a tale is all this time.
yeah,
for sure.
So I'm curious, like, how does the framework of this book, how does it line up with, I guess, your philosophy on that at a greater scale?
Yeah. I mean, if you look at, for example, let's take the Netherlands again, right? As an example, the Netherlands has barely reckoned with its kind of trifecta of colonial past, which brought huge riches to the Netherlands, right, from the 1600s onwards, with its slavery past, and with its collaboration past with the Nazis, because relative to population, the most people in Western Europe were deported, or the most Jews were deported from the Netherlands, for example. And if you take all of the German occupied territories, Netherlands is third behind Poland and Hungary relative to population. So it's really it's really a major, it's been the Netherlands has been has basically dodged kind of the scrutiny of history that if you compare that with Germany, but it's also a smaller economy, but still, sunlight is the best disinfectant. I mean, it should, what I'm arguing for in the book, of historical transparency, of a case of moral transparency, or a moral reckoning with history, should apply to my own country and its horrific colonial slavery and passive collaboration.
Right.
In a way, of course, the scrutiny is so much on Germany, but it applies to so many other companies and corporations, and the argument that I make is a global one, is one that applies across the board, not just to Germany.
Yeah. Just get it out in the open.
Exactly.
Be honest about it. You don't have to turn your companies in. You don't have to self-flagellate. You don't have to say, "Oh, we're the worst." Just be open and say, "Hey, this is what our ancestors did, and this is what it was, and here are the bad parts, and here's what they meant to us as family member, ancestors, etc. And that is what it is. And now we're able to move on, but not whitewashing it or just erasing it completely. Is that fair?
Yeah, that is absolutely fair.
Yeah,
it is absolutely fair.
I mean, obviously, I'm sure you're familiar with this, having lived in America. Were you in America at the time? I mean, this was only a couple of years ago when all the Confederate statues were getting torn down.
Yes.
It's similar. I think
I mentioned it in the introduction of my book, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. The facing of the past, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And it creates an interesting moral dilemma where it's like, Robert E. Lee was fighting, for the Confederates against the Union. Yeah. And means something to a certain subset of people, but also means a very different thing to a different subset. Was fighting against the Union, ostensibly the side that won the war. Yeah. Should he be, depicted in public spaces, or should that be something that's reserved for, a museum?
Exactly. So my argument is always for radical transparency, right? That is in either, whether you want to display something like that in a museum, or the families that I write about. I mean, it's really radical transparency. And if you don't want to submit to radical transparency regarding your past, then you should one rename things. Mm-hmm. But there's so many solutions now to apply radical transparency with regards to the past. It's painful, but it's also necessary because it's a holistic approach, right? You want to judge people on the entirety of their life's actions.
Right. Would you make a distinction with a personal basis versus, I guess, a corporate one? Like if because again, I think we're sort of philosophizing on a grand scale here.
Yeah, totally.
But if I'm bringing up my great-great-grandparents, I'm sure if I dig deep in the history, there's probably some terrible things.
Right.
I don't doubt that my 1800s relatives were all perfect people.
No.
What they did, I don't know. Is it to the extent that we're discussing? Probably not. But certainly there's bad things. Do I need to preface that every time I just discuss my family and say, oh, here's my great grandfather who was a terrible racist and an awful guy, but also
we're talking about public figures, right? We're talking about public historical figures with a modicum of whether this was political power or financial influence, which is still which continues on living, right? I mean, it is about a multi-generational relevance, because again, as we just saw with the example of the BMW Foundation, Herbert Quandt, but there's also the very Porche Foundation. At neither of them is there any mention of their brutal SS past or their brutal past of exploitation, right? And where the people that are in control now are the children of Herbert Quandt, or the children of Ferry and the grandchildren of Ferdinand Porche. So it is, it's something, because these are still public figures, right? They are named in the Automotive Hall of Fame in Dearborn, Michigan, for example, right? And they're held up as examples, through all these entities, whether that's these massive global charitable foundations or these academic chairs or these museums or these corporate headquarters or these media prizes, right? Without it transparent who these people actually were. And I wanted also to make that accessible to a global audience, and not just, even Germans are not aware of their own history in that sense, because they're so inundated with revelations regarding the Third Reich still on a daily basis, and are slightly desensitized to these revelations that, another company with a Nazi past, or another beloved patriarch, or famous beloved patriarch, So in a way, these families are also able to, or these companies, to hide these histories in plain sight.
Because people are so desensitized. It's like, all of our ancestors living in this nation were guilty in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, and one of the questions I also ask myself is, why did nobody in Germany write this book, right? And Germany at its core is still a very conservative, provincial, and in many ways, so very hierarchical country. And with much stricter libel laws or press laws than the U.S., right? Which were thankfully it's protected by the First Amendment. Many things are, and for a German, to scrutinize power in Germany is still a very difficult thing in a very deeply hierarchical and conservative society. It's something much easier to question power in the U.S., I find, and to go after one of these very powerful families, right? Not only economically and financially, but also politically, because they're big donors to the ruling political parties. These families can always turn a question around, what did your father and grandfather, what did your family do during the Third Reich? And who are you to question us, basically? Yeah. Because power is not that easily scrutinized in Germany still, because of its deeply hierarchical nature of society.
And then it just seems like you create a constant scorekeeping of history.
Totally, right?
Who is historically the worst and who is actually the most oppressed.
Yeah, it's not, it should be, it's not whataboutism, or, it's relativism. It's not, it should be on a ad hoc, you should judge examples on its own merits, right? Or on its like a Ferry Porche Foundation or a BMW Foundation, Herbert Quandt. Look at what these people did, and then make up your own mind, of whether it's appropriate to name, major global institutions after them without any kind of realization of who these people are.
Right. Yeah, and I think I think that I wonder if there's something to be said for duality here,
right?
Culturally speaking, and not only in America, but I think probably across the world. Just to leave nuance and recognize that, history is extremely complex, and, there are evil people that do good things, and there's good people that do evil things. And I think maybe leaving room to be truly honest about, the misdeeds of someone, but also things that they did that contributed in some way to, our current world.
Right.
And again, you don't have to make some type of value judgment that is so binary. Am I
totally.
off base here?
No, because I'm just talking about gray skills, right? I mean, it's new. It is important to have nuance, but there is no nuance when you don't show the history, right? Again, you don't learn from history by only showing the good. You learn from history. You need to be informative, And I would say in a day and age where there's so much mis and disinformation going around globally, it's even more important. particularly by these families who hold so much power and wealth, the least one can ask of them is to just be honest about history. If you can't even submit to that, one of the things that really came out of the book was my book was published in April 2022, and I wrote an essay for the New York Times at the day that the book was published, or it was published at the day that the book came out. And at the time, Porche PF family was very busy with spinning out Porsche from the Volkswagen Group. It was a huge public stock market listing, an IPO on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. And they were, just as my book and this essay was published, were going around the Porche PF family with their bankers and lawyers, going around to institutional investors in the US and the UK, asking if they want to be cornerstone investors in these IPO, in this stock market listing. And, because of the fate of Adolf Rosenberger, the Jewish co-founder of Porsche, who was erased from Porsche history, people started asking, or investors started asking them, particularly in the US and the UK, if you're going to lie about your history, are you also going to lie about your financials? And so they had to put in a clause in the SEC form here in the US listing, saying, well, revelations regarding the period 1933 to 45 might come out, which may adversely affect the stock price. And as a result, they decided to clean house and come to a moral settlement or a moral compensation for the heirs of Adolf Rosenberger, who live in California, in Claremont, California, that would rewrite Adolf Rosenberger back into the history of Porsche. Now, of course, one of the world's most recognizable and most coveted brands, right? Because a financial compensation had already happened back in 1950, where Adolf Rosenberger's lawyer went behind his back and settled with Porche PFs and gave Adolf Rosenberger for his 10% share as a compensation, 50,000 Deutschmark, and a choice between a Volkswagen Beetle or a Porsche sports car. Mind you, his 10% stake in Porsche today would have been worth 7 billion.
Yeah, a bit of a pittance.
Right.
Yeah.
To say the least.
Yeah.
It's an understatement.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, in these types of cases, I'm like, two specific families that were ousted, like Rosenberger.
Right.
Those types of, payment systems, I think make sense. You would just hope that they would be equal to whatever the value was. Which in this case, this is not, obviously not what happened.
Right, because he was Aryanized in 1935, or his stake in Porsche was Aryanized in 1935 for the nominal value of his shares that he paid for that he put in to the company when he co-founded in 1930. So he wasn't given the market value of his shares, so that already made it an Aryanization because he wasn't paid what he was supposed to be paid. And then subsequently, to add insult to injury, he was also erased from Porsche history, even though he was the driving commercial force in the first few years of the Porsche car firm.
Wow. Yeah, I'm curious, is there something specific about this, this time in history, World War II, that makes, kind of the cover-up and the whitewashing, specifically morally contemptuous to you versus other conflicts, right? Like every bullet that's ever been fired or every weapon that's ever been made was made by a company.
Totally.
So I'm curious, was your goal with this focused on specifically World War II because of the evils of the Nazi regime?
No, I think it was about the continuation of power and money that still exists, and kind of the brazen. I mean, the starting point again is contemporary. It's about kind of the contemporary cover-up. That's what I wanted to. The history is the backstory. But the story in the end is about 2 days, about the contemporary cover-up by some of the world's most powerful and richest people today, right? And if you look at historical parallels, I would think that, the economic and political volatility of the Weimar Republic and the Devil's Pact that the German industrialists made with Hitler is similar to, say, the economic and political volatility of Yeltsin's Russia in the 1990s, the oligarchs, profiting greatly off of that by the privatization of state assets in Russia, and then making its devil's pact with Putin in the early 2000s, which of course still endures to this day.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you could look at America, right? There's very many companies and corporations that profit off of, foreign wars that America engages in.
Totally.
In some cases, it seems like some of the companies might even lobby to instigate the wars, right? And that, hold, government positions to try to create the wars to then profit off of the back end, which is, insidious in its own way. I guess I'm curious, so. Like, should these companies also, come outright and say, hey, Iraq war, we're sorry, like, I wonder if they also have the same moral standard, because it seems like, again, these things are happening all the time.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, I do think that either through public scrutiny, right, or through hard-hitting reporting, these companies should be held accountable. It's similar what I would say, like the book that Jeremy Scale wrote about Blackwater, for example, right? The private mercenary. And he also did a lot of research about it. He also did a lot of reporting on Halliburton and these kind of companies, how they profited off the Iraq war, right? If these companies don't want to fess up, about their role in wars or profiting from wars, it is up to the public to exert that kind of scrutiny or that pressure, or up to the media to do its role of holding these companies and these governments accountable. And and whether that leads to lawsuits where these companies fess up, or often these claims end up in settlements, right? Where the company doesn't acknowledge any kind of wrongdoing or culpability. Because that's exactly what happened with the German companies during the 1990s, which allowed them to cover it up today. And when they settled in the late 1990s, the Clinton administration initiated negotiations with the German federal government because mass claims by survivors of forced and slave labor were being were being filed here in the U.S. against some of Germany's most well-known companies like BMW, Volkswagen, Daimler, Allianz, you name it, right? And they were so afraid of their shares standing in sale price that they started negotiating with the U.S. government for a wholesale compensation of surviving forced and slave laborers. At the same time, of course, with the end of the Cold War, you had millions of former forced and slave laborers from the Soviet Union suddenly saying, hey, we lived under the Iron Curtain, we lived behind the Iron Curtain for 45 years, but prior to that, we were also exploited by the Nazi regime, by Germany, by German companies and mimes. So you had these two forces that collide in the 1990s. So what ends up happening is a settlement where the German federal government pays $5 billion into this compensation and restitution fund, or compensation fund for surviving forced and slave laborers. And German business as a whole pays up $5 billion into this compensation fund. Now, of the $5 billion paid by German businesses, 60% was paid by only 18 companies like Daimler and BMW and Volkswagen. Thousands of German companies paid in 500 euros, like a pittance, like a symbolic gesture. And the highest payout for surviving slave laborers was about $10,000, which is a pittance, which is again a pittance. But I think most grievously, in that settlement, there was a clause which said German companies as a whole do not admit any kind of wrongdoing, culpability, or guilt for the crimes that happened or that they perpetrated during the Third Reich. So they paid money, but they never took any kind of moral responsibility.
Kind of like a civil suit, I guess. It's
exactly.
Like, hey, we'll pay you out.
It was a civil suit.
Right? Yeah. So we'll pay you, but we will.
It was a civil settlement. Yeah, exactly. We'll pay you, but we don't acknowledge any wrongdoing. So after that, right, their slate was wiped clean, and they could pretend like nothing happened, which in turn, for the past 25 years or past 2 decades, led these companies to pretend like nothing happened and they didn't do anything wrong, right? Only if they're forced to admit any kind of culpability through, again, public scrutiny or media reporting.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating dilemma. Again, if you look at, had the war gone the other way, right? Had the Third Reich been victorious.
Yeah.
I don't think that's necessarily what happened, because I think America probably would have, been fine, generally speaking.
Yeah.
But
did you watch The Man in the High Castle?
I didn't.
Okay.
My parents watched it, and they thought it was great. Did you like it?
Yeah, very much.
It was good, right?
Yeah, it was good.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. I probably should. I mean, it's like right in the line of things that I'm weirdly curious about. But I wonder if the financiers that supported the French and the British, they would have been put on trial. I wonder if they would have been brought in front of some type of committee and said, you funded these terrible, allied forces that tried to, stop German imperialism, I guess. I don't even know. Aryanism.
Yeah. I'm sure, or they were probably all would have been summarily executed. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't think there would have been any trials, or it would have been show trials. You're right.
Right.
Yeah.
Which, again, and then they would have had a war with Russia, which is...
Right.
Yeah, and I wonder if they would have done the same thing, if they would have said, "All right, just show trial, get rid of these people, and move on."
Right.
It's a bizarre situation, but I think transparency, is reasonable. I think transparency is a reasonable sort of request, just to be like, hey, just acknowledge what has happened in the past. You don't have to, it's not your fault necessarily as the heir that got a fortune. You were born into this bizarre situation, but just acknowledge what happened.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there is this, it's not, again, it's not the sins of the father that they're responsible for, but they are responsible for coming to terms with shepherding this huge fortune with all these economic interests to at least do good by that and be transparent, right? And then there's also, I think that's really what's still missing, not only in Germany but in many other countries is historical transparency with regards to and people they don't learn anything. Again, they don't learn anything from history that way.
Interesting. There's a question here from Ron 8683. Are the impacts and outcomes of World War II top of mind for the average European, or is it seen as a distant memory, especially relevant in the current world context?
No, I think it's very much top of mind at the moment. As Europe is going through its own rightward populist shift, where it is, there are a lot of concerns with regards to how and when and will history repeat itself in some form or another, and it is doomed to. So yeah, it's very much top of mind. I was just in Amsterdam. I mean, it's it's a very pertinent topic at the moment, unfortunately. Yeah, due to the politics or the political situation on the continent.
Wow. Yeah, it's. I'm curious, in your research, I mean, you spent 4 years working on this book, living in Germany the whole time. Was there anything in your research, just generally speaking, that you uncovered that you found particularly interesting or fascinating to you that didn't necessarily make the book, or you feel like is not highlighted in the book?
I mean, I think it is the complete lack of reflection on the side of the patriarchs, which on kind of the way they profited from other people's lives, literally, and livelihood. I think that was really what, I could have given so many more countless examples of the way that they just, again, without any kind of reflection or compunction, robbed other people from their livelihoods, or ended up robbing people from their lives through forced and slave labor, or through people being deported to concentration or extermination camps.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is really something that, I could have, you need to keep these narratives tight, right? Because you can't take the reader's attention for granted. So it's really important to, to focus on perhaps the most abject examples. But it's really, I could have given so many more examples, but so not many of. I cut about 100 pages from the book in the end.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
and you had mentioned, I believe, that the attorneys of these families never came after you or never persecuted you.
No, they didn't. They didn't, because that's the adverse PR strategy, right? Because for them, or from their perspective, because going after foreign journalists, they want to sweep it under the rug, these histories. So going after a foreign journalist was writing a book about them would only bring attention to the subject, and that's what they don't want. They want to sweep it under the rug. They want to ignore it.
Right.
So I never got any kind of threats or lawyer letters. Yeah.
Is your research on this topic the reason you've never purchased a Porsche? Is this why you're boycotting? You're saying, you know what? This is the reason.
Exactly.
You could have probably...
It's my lack of royalties which is keeping me from it. No, but I aesthetically, I just find a Porsche. I would never buy a Porsche. Just also prior to this book, it's just that I just find it a little. I just find it gauche. Yeah. Also not.
That's why I didn't
I'm such a square. Mark, I'm so sorry. I'm such a square. I like my I like my Volvos.
Oh right. Was it Swedish?
Well, they're owned by Chinese now, but it's still made in Sweden. They're owned by a Chinese company, but they're still made in Sweden.
Let's say a friend of yours is like, "Hey, take my car. It's a Volkswagen."
I'm totally fine with that. Yeah.
Okay.
As long as it's a stick. As long as it's automatic.
Yeah.
I can't drive stick.
This is 2019.
Exactly.
2019.
Yeah.
If it's a 1939 Volkswagen, you're like, whoa, we can't have that.
Yeah.
The 1919 or the 2019, you're like, yeah, I'll take that all day. That's fine. This has been a fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed looking at this through a historical perspective and sort of unpacking all the details and where it leaves us in the modern time. We had mentioned the Reimann family.
Yeah.
And you had said, obviously, because they had sort of a disparate history of both being the aggressor but also the victim, that they did a good job. What is an example of a family that had, only, I guess you could say, negative patriarchs that were involved in the Third Reich that also handled it in an appropriate and reasonable way, in your opinion?
So there's one family, one dynasty I write about in the book, which is called the Oetkers, which is, they control, a slew of luxury hotels around the world. They control Germany's largest beer brewer. But they most famously own a brand called Dr. Oetker, which is a mix of, which is pudding mixes and baked goods. They're mostly known they're not as known in the US, but they sell their products globally, also very famous in Canada, the UK, European continent, you name it. And they had a very interesting split because their patriarch, Rudolf August Oetker, was really an ideological Nazi who became a voluntary SS officer who was trained in Dachau concentration camp, as an SS officer. And his stepfather was a CEO of Dr. Oetker, really trained him to be, it was really a family full of Nazis. And Rudolf August Oetker ended up having 8 children from 3 marriages, which many of the industrialists that I write about did, and 6 children, 8 children, 7 children. And the family actually split literally into the 5 older ones wanting to investigate after his death, unequivocally come out and say, our father was a Nazi. And the 3 younger siblings who were born in the late 70s to his 3rd wife, who's still alive, saying, we don't want to disavow our father. And it ended up actually splitting up the conglomerate, not only because of the history, but it literally broke up this one of Germany's biggest and most well-known family conglomerates.
Wow. Into
the 5 siblings splitting, keeping the Dr. Oetker part, and the 3 younger siblings getting a slew of luxury hotels and some other assets. And again, it didn't only have to do with breaking up about the father's Nazi past, but also about CEO succession and things like that. But this being a part of it, where the younger siblings continue to maintain the Rudolf August Oetker Foundation, named after their SS-trained, Dachau-trained father, and the 5 older ones wanting nothing to do with that history, or nothing to do with history. Don't want to continue the name of their father and their step grandfather, who were such avowed Nazis.
Oh wow!
Yeah, So it's actually, it ends up, splitting these, combative family dynasties into two, even this topic.
So the I guess the first generation children, they handled it well, where they said, "Hey, we're going to discontinue it. We're going to acknowledge it.
Exactly.
And we'll move on."
And one would think, right, the closer it is to the generation, right? I mean, these the eldest five were born between, I think, 1949 and like 1959 or something, right?
That's interesting because you're closer to the modern age, but also farther from the atrocities.
Well, the younger ones are from from the 70s, right? You would think that they had it more distant, but because they couldn't distance themselves from their father, and you see that in many of these families that I write about, these billionaire families that I write about.
That's an interesting ripple. The later the children come, the more proximity they have.
Exactly.
Wow. Yeah, I guess you're farther away, and I also wonder if your relationship with your father is probably different, right? If he's an old man, you're like, he's an old man.
Yeah, how could he have been trained as an SS officer at Dachau, right? Yeah.
Oh, that's an interesting ripple. Yeah. Oh, wow. This has been a fascinating conversation, David. I really appreciate you spending the time to come into my quaint little tent here.
I loved your quaint little tent, and I loved our conversation. So thank you for having me, Mark.
Yeah, of course. We talked briefly about Russia. Right. And tomorrow, I'm actually having a conversation with Curtis Fox. He is a former Green Beret that has now dedicated his time to sort of studying Russian history as well as their military strategy, which is just a really interesting conversation. And that'll be tomorrow. So anyone that's watching, if you're interested in that, it goes through a lot of the Russian history of the, kind of the same period, roughly like the 20th century, leading into the invasion of Ukraine. And sort of the entire historical narrative, as well as their actual strategy of chaos, of like, sort of placing ethnic Russians and creating chaos and then utilizing that chaos to then, roll into, occupying land. Fascinating conversation. That'll be tomorrow. If the people are interested in reading your book or reading any of your other works, where can they find you?
They can find me, they can Google Nazi Billionaires. They will find everything. They can visit my personal website, daviddejong.net, or follow me on Instagram or Twitter, or X as it's called now, at David the Jong. So it's anglicized the from the Jong. Yes.
The younger. You should call it the young one. David the young one. Yeah,
David the young one. Unfortunately,
awesome.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it was already taken. Yeah. Darn it.
Dang.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Are you working on another book right now? Are you cooking on something?
Well, I'm really busy in the Middle East with my correspondent, but I do have another book that I have been wanting to work on for a few years now, which focus on Dutch-American business dynasties.
Oh, yeah. Probably having a lot to do with New Amsterdam right here. Right.
Later generations.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, Russell Shorter wrote this great book about New Amsterdam and the positive, the progressive influence, or the liberal influences that the Roosevelts and the Vanderbilts and all these Dutch families brought in with their wealth, kind of the Dutch Mayflowers to, or via New Amsterdam, to the U.S. at large, and I'm focusing on 5 Dutch-American business dynasties with their very dour and pure Calvinism that brought in, that have funded many things that go against their social beliefs and are helping their business interests.
Oh, interesting. Wow. I think we do need to thank the Dutch for showing us how to sort of clear out water. I don't know if you know this. I mean, I'm sure you probably did. That in New York, I believe, the island of Manhattan, when it was sort of settled by the Dutch, they used the same techniques to sort of clear out the water and make livable, sort of habitable land. That was done in the Netherlands. Obviously, the Nederlands, like the lower lands that were full of water and swampy. That then they were able to move the water to create a livable place. I'm pretty sure they did the same thing in Manhattan, using the same strategies.
Mannahatta, as the island was then called. You know, and the Native American name to make Peter Stuyvesant, who made it, who founded New Amsterdam and made it into this commune that we then later traded the English to.
Right.
And we got Suriname in return.
Oh wow.
Yeah, which remained a colony until 1975.
Oh, I got to do a deep dive on that. That sounds fascinating. But anyway, David, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. And when your new book is out, I would love to have you back. Let's talk about.
I would love to be
Let's
back.
talk about some more things.
I already missed the tent.
Till next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
There was a very politically useful narrative that the Russians were fighting for Donald Trump to win the 2016 election, and that turns out to not be true, and the FBI knew that a long time ago.
This is Curtis Fox. He's a former Green Beret who has now dedicated his life to researching and analyzing Russian military strategy.
The Russians really stepped on their crank when they invaded Ukraine. Zelensky's presidency was on the rocks. The Russians created that monster.
They made a war hero.
That's a great way to say it, a living martyr.
That's right. There are very few people that know the Russian military better than this guy. And today, he's going to take us through everything.
To create riots and public displays of displeasure, they used the Night Wolves biker gang, of which Putin is a member.
Putin is a member of a biker gang?
Yeah.
He explains Russia's hybrid warfare tactics, using a mixture of chaos, propaganda, and ethnic division to successfully conquer their enemies.
They start slowly surging in assets into South Ossetia and Abkhazia to train these local militias, and then they start doing exercises on the northern border, and then they start needling the Georgians.
I'll be honest, I didn't know a ton about Russian military strategy. I mean, I understood that Russia invaded Ukraine and that they also tried to beat up Rocky, I guess. But other than that, I didn't know anything. But after this episode of my conversation with Curtis, I feel like I know much more why the Russian military is doing what they're doing, what Vladimir Putin's ultimate plan is, and how we as Americans are just as susceptible to the same propaganda and chaos hybrid warfare strategy as any other country. So, without further ado, zip up your tents, get cozy in your little sleeping bag, and enjoy Curtis Fox. Welcome to camp.